Hello, Richard Fording. Welcome. Can we hear you for a while? Richard, hi. Hi, we can see you. Can we hear you? Yeah, we can hear you. No, we can't.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now it's fine. Thank you.
Great.
Okay. Έχουν μπει. Joe, yeah.
Lisa Pulaski just emailed me and said she can hear us, but she can't turn on her video. Lisa, are you on?
Because she entered as a guest, I think, or not.
Are you on conference 1, Lisa?
No, conference 1 and 2 are us.
Okay.
Give me a second.
The host from the computer of the host, you can turn her to a panelist.
Yeah.
Dimitris,
Give me a second. Yeah, can we allow to talk? Okay.
Okay, now I see your name.
Lisa.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we gave you the power to speak.
Okay, thank you.
We become omnipotent in this new system.
Can you also turn on your camera now, Lisa?
I don't see that option here. I just had.
Let's see if we can do that from our side. Panelists. Yeah, make panelist. Wait, Lisa. Lisa. Why can't well? Lisa. Guest. More promote panelist. Lisa, I think that now we can even see you. Or we should be able to see you.
Okay, there we go. Now here I am.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you? And I'm not sure. Oh, okay. I see Dean Messina there. Okay. All right. Good.
Okay. I think we have our vice rector. We are expecting shortly our dean, and we are almost ready to start. Give me a second. We're also waiting for participants to join us. And I welcome Dean Zarotiadis. I think, can we see you also in the screen?
Unfortunately, due to technical difficulties today, it won't be so easy. I will try my best, but I'm not sure about that.
Okay, never mind. But we can hear you perfectly, so that's fine from our side. Okay, it's 6 o'clock in Thessaloniki. It is 10 o'clock in Tuscaloosa, and I think we can officially start our joint session. I am Yannis Papageorgiou. I would like to welcome you all, to wish good afternoon to participants in Greece and good morning to participants in the United States. On behalf of the Department of Political Sciences of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, I want to welcome you to this online two-day workshop on US politics and transatlantic relations after the 2020 elections, organized by our department and the Department of Political Science from the University of Alabama. Some very small technical announcements at the beginning. There will be 2 panels today and 2 panels tomorrow. I would ask all participants to mute themselves when they're not speaking. There will be a Q&A session at the end of each panel, and it will be in writing from the audience, and the chairs will make the relevant announcement each time. I don't want to take, Zoom time is precious, so I just want to present in a very few words how this workshop came, show the light. It came out of discussions with students in our class on the US politics last autumn. It was initially a much lower level initiative. We were thinking to do a small Greek initiative, but then I had the idea, which I think came out to be brilliant, to contact our friends and colleagues from the University of Alabama. Joe Smith eagerly espoused the idea, and the Department of Political Sciences also greatly contribute to what we are going to go through in these 2 days. So I'm hopeful that this initiative will be useful and to all attendees, and as well as to us, and that it will be one of many more to come. This is one of the few positive outcomes of the pandemic. Zoom meetings are now easier and also more, how to put it, more natural for both for us and for students to follow. And I'm sure that even when the pandemic goes, some good things of that pandemic will remain. I now want to invite our co-organizer, Joe Smith, Chair of the Department of the Political Science of the University of Alabama, to take the floor. Joe, you have the floor.
Microphone. Thank you, Giannis. It has been a true pleasure working together to plan this conference. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the University of Alabama Department of Political Science. Our goals for this conference are to provide an interesting and informative perspective on political issues that are important to both Greece and the United States, and to provide a discussion that will be interesting to our audience around the world, and to hopefully lay the groundwork for future academic interaction between our 2 faculties. I now invite Dr. Joseph Messina, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to say a few words.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon in Thessaloniki. I'm Joseph Messina. I'm a professor of geography, and I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Alabama. I'm very glad to be able to welcome the participants and audience members to this initial conference of the political science faculties of the University of Alabama and Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. The formal relationship between our 2 universities dates back more than a decade now. Faculty and officials have visited back and forth, enriching both universities through scholarship and teaching. Now, unfortunately for all of us, COVID, none of us were able to travel, but I wasn't able to travel last year to meet Rector Professor Nicola Papianou and the authorities with the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki as we had planned. Hopefully, we will be able to meet in person next year. As a geographer and just as a person, I'm very interested to visit Greece. I've never been, so it's very exciting. In the meantime, it is good that we are able to adapt virtually. I agree with the organizers. I think Zoom is allowing us to do some things that we would otherwise not normally be able to do. And I believe that this conference is another step in the strong relationship between our 2 universities. And I hope that it will be a fruitful academic exchange. I'd like to commend and thank the 2 department chairs, Joseph Smith and Giannis Papageorgiou, for organizing it. It's really a great event, and I have very high hopes for positive outcomes. Thank you very much, and good luck.
Thanks. And now Dr. Lisa Pulaski, Associate Dean for International Programs at the College of Arts and Sciences, will say a few words.
Sure. Thank you all. This is an exciting event for me just because, as Dean Messina mentioned, we were not able to travel last year. We hope to be able to do that next year. My name is Lisa Pulaski. I am the Associate Dean for International Programs, and I work closely with Helen Baksavanadu, who is the head of international relations at Aristotle University. And she has been very helpful in terms of allowing this program to continue for so many years. And I'm really excited that we at least can have, again, a virtual event to strengthen the partnership even more. We hope to have a few more kinds of partnerships like this. Over the years, we've had several faculty doing exchange, and they continue to do research. So there's lots of wonderful outcomes that have come as including this particular conference. So I'm excited to see this. We've also had many student exchanges, and we hope to increase the amount of student exchanges moving forward, as well as having faculty exchanges as well. So again, thank you. Again, thank you, Joe Smith. Thank you, Dean Messina, and the rector, and again, administrators at Aristotle University, and as well as the chair of political science at Aristotle University. I really appreciate your assistance. And I know you were here last year giving some talks and so forth. So, I'm sorry, again, we can't see each other face to face, but this is great. So I'll let you go on that. Thank you so much. It's going to be an exciting conference.
Thank you, Dean Messina and Associate Dean Pulaski. I'll now hand it back to Ioannis for some words from officials from Aristotle University.
Thank you, Joe, and thank Dean Messina and Elisa Pawlowski. We've met, and I'm sure that we'll meet again. I want to invite the Vice Rector of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Stratos Stylianidis, to give a welcoming word, and I thank you very much for being present today to the start of the conference. Vice Rector, you have the floor.
It's my pleasure, John. Good afternoon to all colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the rectorate authorities of our university at today's workshop that is co-organized by Aristotle University and the University of Alabama. This workshop is for us exceptionally important, especially for our scientific community of political sciences, but also for other sciences as well, since it addresses one of the most critical issues of the modern political history, the global political mapping of transatlantic relations as they have been shaped after the 2020 US elections. Scientists from both universities, originating from the schools of political sciences, I'm sure that they will exchange their perspectives on these topics and share their opinions, ideas, and forecasts for the new era of international politics, focusing even more on the US-Europe and the US-Greek relations that concern our countries. I would like to take this opportunity to remind you that this initiative takes place in the context of a very solid strategic partnership that has been built between Aristotle University and the University of Alabama for many years now, dated back on a common memorandum of understanding signed in 2013 by both universities. The numbers are there and you can find them regarding the academic staff exchange during this period. 45 incoming and 18 outgoing academic staff have collaborated in the fields of, many fields in our common collaboration: theater, music, geology, biology, English studies, classics, chemistry, architecture, religious studies, physics, film studies, information technology, engineering, medicine, law, political studies. And of course, in the meantime, mutual visits have been organized, with the last one from the University of Alabama being unfortunately canceled due to the COVID-19 restrictions. Except for symposia and annual delegation visits, other common scientific activities between us include symposia, conferences, research and publications of research articles, workshops, lectures, meetings with our students, etc. A joint Erasmus Plus international program is also currently active. And before closing, as the Vice Rector for Research and Lifelong Learning, responsible for the research policy in our university, I would like to say that this remarkable event could also serve as a great opportunity to join our forces in terms of funded research programs and technology transfer actions. Aristotle University of Thessaloniki is the largest academic institution in Greece and one of the largest in Southeastern Europe, and demonstrates intensive research activity with inflow of over than 50 million of euros annually from funded research and hundreds of active partnerships worldwide. Horizon Europe, the European Union's new research and innovation program of 116 billion of dollars is expected to run in the period 2021 and 2027, is designed to focus on some of the world's biggest challenges, from cancer and climate change to health of our cities and food supplies. And of course, it offers to the US researchers the possibility to collaborate with large European projects, as well as to apply for generous grants available to individuals interested in spending part of their careers here in Europe, and we hopefully here in Greece. And it presents also opportunities for entrepreneurs and innovators with breakthrough, disruptive ideas, interested in scaling up them in Europe. And in this context, I invite you and your colleagues from the University of Alabama to investigate together potential research partnerships. And I would like to congratulate the organizers for this initiative. I'm pretty sure it will be a very successful and productive workshop for all participants. And hopefully we will meet each other in face next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Rector. Thank you for your kind words. And I'd like to give the floor now to Professor Grigorios Zarotiadis, the Dean of the Department of the Faculty of Economic and Political Sciences. Dean Zarotiadis, you have the floor.
Dear Yanni, esteemed guests and colleagues from the University of Alabama, as well as from our faculty and our institution. It is a pleasure also for me to be present in this starting point of the very interesting and very significant, extremely significant academic event that is going to be organized in a virtual way, unfortunately. Allow me also once again to apologize for not being able to let you see me. I hope that this will be, I'm sure that this will be the case tomorrow, when I will get the opportunity also to contribute to the actual proceedings of the event in the frame of in one of the sessions. Anyway, I would like to mention that this is one of the initiatives that built all of them together an extremely extroverted department, as the Department of Political Sciences is, in the frame of an extremely extroverted faculty, the Faculty of Economic and Political Sciences, and finally in the frame of an extremely extroverted, efficient, and academically evolving institution, the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. I'm perfectly sure that the final results of these 2 days will be of the value and the significance that we expect to be, given that the content and the goals that have been set for this event are pretty much in line with contemporary questions and issues that have to do with the global geopolitical and geoeconomic situation architecture, but also especially with the situation in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, meaning thereby the vital space of the evolution of Hellenism and of other countries and cultures in the specific region. The elections in the United States, as it is easy understandable for everybody of us, and the socioeconomic and political conditions are of extreme importance for the evolution in all around the world, like it is the case also for other countries, especially perhaps for what we are experiencing and what we wish to accomplish in the wider region of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And I have to say that especially for this region, Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and specifically our faculty is focusing dynamically in order to contribute to this academic and also socio-political discussion. Just allow me to say that in this direction, we run an interdisciplinary laboratory for Black Sea and Mediterranean studies. And also we are proud to host in Aristotle University, as also the Vice Rector knows pretty much, that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for the Black Sea, which is a node of the global SDSN network, which I'm pretty much sure you know perfectly well. So given all these initiatives, the proceedings of these 2 days will not be simply an exceptional event, but moreover will contribute to the continuous scientific and academic work of our institution for serving the sustainable development in our region. And I'm sure that in this direction, our collaboration with the University of Alabama is of extremely high importance. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to see you tomorrow as well.
Thank you, Dean Zalotiadis. Thank you all the authorities, Dean Messina, Vice Dean Pavlovsky, Vice Rector Stylianidis, and Dean Zalotiadis for your kind words. We are finishing the first part of the official opening of this Zoom conference. You are most welcome to stay as long as you want, of course. We are not sending you away. And I want to invite the chair of our first effective session, Professor Theodore Hadjipantelis, to take the floor. The session will analyze and draw the lessons from the electoral results of the 2020 US election. Professor Hadjipantelis, you have the floor, and you will take over afterwards so that we can take a breath. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis. But let's let Aris, the head of the department, to say some words if he likes.
Thank you. It's okay. On behalf of our department, I welcome all you to this conference, and I hope that I'm sure that it will be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Aris. There are always elections, and also we should talk about the U.S. elections. I remember the American Voter Book back in 1960. It has an effect on political science and on comparative political science also. But let me say that we will talk first. The first session is about the analysis and lessons from the electoral results. Let's talk about Biden and whatever. And we have two distinguished guests from Alabama, from USA, George Halley and Rich Fording, and also two distinguished persons from our side, from the Aristotle University for the Faculty of Economics and Political Sciences, Ioannis Andreadis and Ioanna Costarella. I have to say to all of you that you have 8 to 10 minutes for expressing some ideas and talk about your theme, and then we will have some questions and answer session till 7:25, Yanis, isn't it? This is the end of the session.
The end of the first session will be at around 9:05 Greek time.
7:25, 11:25 in USA. So let's begin. I think the first is George Halley, and he will talk about the current state of polarization and negative partisanship in politics. George, you have the floor.
All right, thank you so much for this invitation to be here. I imagine that observing American politics from abroad can be confusing at times, simply because it can be quite confusing observing it here. I will note that the things I'll be saying today, they are not universally accepted in political science. A lot of these things are still sort of disputed by different scholars. So people do continue to disagree with some of these things and can do so in good faith. Now, one thing to get started, we take it for granted here in the US that we as a society are politically polarized. This has been a rather pervasive claim for a couple of decades. And I would say that that claim is in part true, but not necessarily the way that a lot of people think of polarization. Now, we're clearly polarized in the sense that our politics are dominated by very high emotions. But what we call affective or emotional polarization is not the same thing as ideological polarization. It's true that Republicans and Democrats seem to really hate each other, but that's not the same thing as saying that Republicans and Democrats have totally dissimilar ideologies or views towards public policy, at least if we're thinking about people out in the electorate. One thing that I should immediately note when talking about polarization and this question of policy polarization, I think I am quite confident that America does not exhibit this kind of polarization. More than 15 years ago, Morris Fiorina at Stanford and his colleagues argued that most people are moderates when it comes to policy, to the extent that they really think about policy at all. And I haven't seen anything since then to really challenge that claim. There are a few people, and some for whom policies are cardinal to vote choice. We can find like single issue abortion voters, for example, but the number of people and the number of issues that are like that is quite small. And Republicans and Democrats in the electorate are especially similar to each other when it comes to their economic policy preferences. Socialism is a non-starter in the US, and so is economic libertarianism. There is really a general liberal consensus that the United States should have a system that we could generally describe as a kind of welfare capitalism. So to make better sense of the partisan anger in the US, I think it's important to put policy questions aside and think about our political identities as being downstream from other forms of social identity. And I think if we do that, some of the seeming paradoxes in American political life can perhaps be resolved. That is, to some degree, our political identities, that is, our partisan identities as a Republican or a Democrat, have, in a sense, become identities in their own right, as sort of a sense, part of our sense of self. So according to this perspective, as we think about politics, as we're becoming initially politically aware, we tend to, know what kind of people we are. We all have different elements of ourself that are important, our racial, ethnic, linguistic, gender, sexual, generational, class, occupational, or regional identities. We all have these things, and we'll all place different values on different characteristics. But in any event, once we have done subconsciously this survey of ourselves, we will then be able to sort of pick out which political party properly belongs to people like ourselves. And that becomes the source of our partisan loyalties rather than sort of a dispassionate analysis of public policy or some deep, philosophical commitment to a particular ideological perspective. So if we think about American politics from this way, we can start to make sense of how it is that our politics can involve some extremely strong emotions even when the stakes of a particular political battle are fairly small, and most people are generally ignorant of, the specifics of any particular political fight. And it also means that ideology may tend to follow partisanship rather than the other way around. That is, for a lot of us, we don't determine whether we are liberals or conservatives until after we have established that we are Democrats or Republicans. And we might not even necessarily know which public policies are associated with these different ideologies or parties. And that means that we will tend to just automatically support whatever policies our party advances, even if that means contradicting something that we thought we held deeply not that long ago. And all of this will lead to extremely strong negative partisanship. Again, even if we don't really have any great stakes in a particular political battle, and we don't even really know what the other side stands for, we still have this understanding that the other side is full of the bad guys, and we want to see them defeated. So to bring all this to the question of Donald Trump and the meaning of his presidency, when he was first elected, I thought it represented this major ideological sea change. I thought it meant that the Republican electorate had made this really sharp move to the right. And I suppose that's true for some percentage of them. And I suspect Rich will talk a little bit more about that. But overall, the Trump presidency and the broader Trump movement was really shockingly devoid of any real substance. But as a president, Trump was really not especially innovative when it came to public policy. Really, for the first 2 years, he essentially outsourced all of domestic policy to Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. He ran for president as something of an isolationist or a non-interventionist, but his foreign policies were not all that disruptive either. And then, of course, for his second 2 years in office, he really wasn't able to do much of anything because his party no longer controlled the House of Representatives. And yet, the Trump presidency nonetheless inspired a lot of very powerful feelings, both among the president's supporters and his opponents. And as I think about what policies were actually put in place, I guess, Trump got his tax cuts, which any Republican president would have done. He put a lot of conservative justices on the court, but again, any Republican president would have done the same thing. So, there really wasn't any major ideological shift that occurred. So I'm willing to say that there never was an ideology of Trumpism. There was really just Trump and this kind of personality cult that built up around him. So to my mind, this is really the most interesting element of the entire Trump phenomenon. That is that in the US, and I think this is even still true with him not even being president, that being a loyalist to Trump or a fervent Trump opponent have become in their own way a kind of social identity, that Trump has become less a figure associated with any particular policies than as a kind of cultural symbol that provokes extremely strong emotions. And again, this remained true even though Trump himself really showed no meaningful consistency when it comes to policy or even consistency in terms of themes of his presidency. I mean, if we think about the Trump campaign of 2016 compared to 2020, there were some extraordinary differences, right? If we think about the 2020 campaign, the most conspicuous absence of that campaign was any mention of immigration at all. Go back and watch the debates between Trump and Biden. The signature issue of Trump 2016 was simply not on the agenda, but it didn't seem to matter to Trump loyalists at all. They remained very strong supporters, despite the fact that, he had really not shown any kind of consistency in terms of what his real agenda was over the course of 4 years. And I would just thinking towards the future, I think that we can say that the Republican Party in the electorate, the Republican voters are going to remain loyal to Trump for the foreseeable future. It's going to stay Trump's party. And so I'm quite confident that if Donald Trump wants the Republican nomination in 2024, he's going to get it, and he's going to get it with very little difficulty. So I will go ahead and make that prediction right now. So it looks like I just hit 9 minutes, so I will pause it there.
Thank you. Quite interesting, and we will have the chance to talk about it, and especially for the Trump era, because there are a lot of people thinking that Trump has, let me say, has a road to follow, but I'm not sure about it. I don't know so much about the U.S. politics, but to my opinion, Trump is a typical Republican, not very different for other Republicans. But anyway, we will talk about it. Let's give the floor to Yanis Andreadis, a colleague from our department. He will talk about the U.S. voter vis-a-vis the Greek voter, the similarities and differences between the two. There are a lot of similarities and differences, Yanis.
Yes, there are. Thank you very much, Theodore, and thank you very much, George. I'm going to add a quantitative level on what you have said in your speech, I think, because I'm going to discuss about affective polarization, about ideological polarization. So our two presentations two talks are connected. So my name is Ioannis Andreadis. I'm a professor here at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. I'm going to compare in this presentation the American voter with the Greek voter. I will start with the similarities between the two of them. But first of all, let me say some words about the infrastructure that makes it possible to compare these two countries and to these two voters. So we have the comparative study of electoral system, which is the common infrastructure that supports both the American National Election Study and the Hellenic National Election Study. With the American National Election Study, we can study the behavior of the American voter, and as Theodore has already mentioned, one significant book that has changed the political analysis world is the one from the 60s by Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes. And with the Hellenic National Election Study, we are able to study the behavior of the Greek citizen, the Greek voter. So in this presentation, I have some fresh new data to present to you. So I'm working with the American National Election Study, the most recent wave, and to be more specific, with the post-election wave, which includes CSCS Module 5, and some preliminary results from the Hellenic National Election Study for the most recent election, so for the 2019, which is a study, a survey that is conducted as part of the Data Pop EU project. And with CSCS Module 5, we have two things. First of all, CSCS Module 5 focuses on citizens' perceptions and of political elites. So we have something new here. We are able to study populist attitudes, and also not new. There are many items to measure political attitudes, voting behavior, left-right polarization, and affective polarization. That these things have been mentioned by George as well. So I'm starting with some not so important and not so significant things, but they show how much we are how much we have in common. So you can see that the distribution for the first question of the comparative study of the CSCS questionnaire, which is about political leaders, is almost the same for both countries. The same is true for the second question, which is about if voters follow politics in the media. You can see a very similar distribution here. So I'm moving fast from these three similarities. The third question is about internal efficacy. So if people think that they are able to understand the most important political issues in their country, and again, you see how common we are, how common are the two distributions on these first items. But what I would like to focus on are on some new things. First of all, this new CSCS anti-elite or populist attitudes battery. if you are familiar with this quantitative analysis and these questionnaires, you would know that CSS has included 7 new items to measure populist attitudes. One of them, as you can see here, the strong leader item, there's an item about preferences for a strong leader. And as you can see, it does not fit with the rest of the items. So this is something that we have found also in previous publications, that strong leader is not part of the anti-elite or populist attitude scale. So if we use weighted Merkel scale analysis on this data for the rest of the items, excluding, I mean, the strong leader item, we can get, in fact, a weak scale for the American voter and a moderate scale for the Greek, the Hellenic voter. Since we are able to build populist attitude scales, we can compare, we have populist attitudes index, and we can compare between the two populations. And as you can see, the American voter is a little bit lower with a populist index of about 3.4, is a little bit lower than the Greek voter with a populist index on value on 3.6. But what is interesting, and this is something that we have presented for the Greek data, but it is the first time these questions have been included in a voter study in the United States. As you can see, both in Greece and in United States, populist attitudes are able to discriminate between parties and voters of parties of voters of presidents here, or candidates. And as you can see, it is common in Greece that New Democracy and Kinal have lower values of this scale, and the other parties higher. And similarly, you can see that the voters of Joe Biden score lower here in this populist attitude scale than voters of Donald Trump. I think this is something that we were expecting, although Donald Trump is not the most typical example of a populist leader. I'm going very fastly to affective polarization that has been mentioned by George. And here is a way to measure affective polarization. So there are questions asking participants in these surveys to rate all parties or a number of parties, or there is a scale from 0 strongly that corresponds to strongly dislike to 10 that corresponds to strongly like. And here you can see the in-party score and the out-party score. So the in-party score is how much you like your own party, the party that you identify with, and the score for out party is how you rate the other party or parties. Someone else needs to stop using its microphone, I think. Anyway, I continue. The difference between the in-party rate and the out-party rate can be used to measure affective polarization. And continuing the discussion by George that we know that United States is a polarized country and affective polarization is strong. You can see here that the Greek population, the Greek citizen, the Greek voter is even more polarized regarding affective polarization. And I also have this affective polarization over time. So now I'm using not only the last data, but also CSCS, older data, so that we can see the development of this phenomenon over time. And as you can see, in the United States, there is a more or less stable score in the latest years. While in Greece, this affective polarization has increased significantly for the latest election. Finally, I'm presenting you the ideological polarization over time. So we have left-right polarization over time here. And here there is a difference, and it is not exactly that I would agree with what George said about American voters are not polarized on issues. it seems, and if my calculations are correct, using the latest American National Election Study of 2020, I mean, it seems that in fact the Republicans are the group that have moved even more to the right, and so they their position on about 7.2 or something like that. So the difference between the Republicans and the Democratic voters have increased, and here is the result of this development. So I think, and I hope that I was on time. I was a little bit worried that I'm running too fast or I'm going to be delayed. I hope I'm on time. This study, as you can see, has been supported by this project, the Innovative Methods in High Quality Data for Populism and Euroscepticism Research. And if you are interested in the deliverables of the project, you can subscribe at DataPop.eu or follow me on Twitter. And that would be all by me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Yanis. Very interesting, and especially the polarization in the U.S. electorate. But we should take into account that saying about left and right in the States, it might be different talking for left and right in Europe or in other continents.
They seem they are learning about left right, and this is why this gap is increasing, I think.
Probably. Anyway, let's continue with Rich Fording about the U.S. extreme right. There is Rich. There is a U.S. extreme right.
Richard, we can see your slide, but we cannot hear you. Your microphone.
Richard.
There we go.
Okay.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes, yes, okay.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my research and thoughts about the current state of U.S. politics and perhaps a little bit on the future. So I want to start by sort of just talking about what I mean here by the extreme right. And let's see if I can get this to advance the slide. Here we go. And so, so I drew up this sort of graphic here just to kind of talk about, not only what the extreme right means in the United States, or at least what I mean by it, but also how it relates to our contemporary politics. And I do think it matters more. I think it's definitely true that it matters more than it has in the past. But by extreme right, I'm talking about the two circles here at the bottom. And, so there's some debate about the degree to which these two groups or sets of attitudes that are reflected by groups representing these ideologies are distinct. But and I don't stand by the sort of the percentage of each circle there that overlaps. But the point is that there are two sort of different right-wing extremist kind of movements, you might say, in the United States. One that has been talked about a lot since Trump came on the scene is what I call the white nationalist movement. Some people refer to it as white supremacist. Some people increasingly in the last few years use the term alt-right. They kind of mean the same thing. And we're talking about people who have extreme levels of hostility toward racial outgroups. Now, there is another sort of faction within the right-wing extremist in the United States, and these are the anti-government groups, or what are sometimes referred to as the patriot movement. Sometimes a subset of this group are the militia groups in the militia movement. And some people sort of refer to these two groups as being kind of interchangeable. And I guess what I would say is that these two groups share a lot of values, particularly the anti-government orientation, but it is not the case that all of the anti-government groups, maybe, or even a majority of them, are what we would call, white nationalists. And so I just want to make that point. They're distinct, but there's a lot of overlap, and they do cooperate and on some initiatives. And finally, the point that I'm going to talk about today is the extent to which these two groups have, especially the white nationalists, have sort of now come to overlap, move into with Trump's base, and more generally move into mainstream politics. So when Trump came on the scene, I think there's started to be a lot of talk about a white racial backlash. There continues to be, I think, in sort of mainstream, non-academic, but even maybe in academic discourse about politics in the U.S. It's kind of conventional wisdom that there has been. And I guess what I would say is that the research that I've done suggests that there is a white racial backlash, but not in the way that many people think. And the way that many people think maybe a backlash has occurred is that there have been more white Americans who display or exhibit what we might call racial prejudice or extremely hostile views toward racial outgroups. And that the data is pretty clear on that has just not happened. And so if you look overall, actually what you find is that attitudes toward racial outgroups have actually become less hostile over time. If you break it out by political party, like I've done in this series of graphs here, what you see is that actually the slight decrease in overall what we call outgroup hostility has been driven by Democrats who have moved sort of to the left on the racial hostility scale, you might say. Republicans have more or less stayed stable. And I should just say also that these graphs, the racial resentment scale is a scale of hostility toward African Americans. And but these are these attitudes toward these particular racial outgroups, African Americans, Latino immigrants, and Muslims, are indeed the most important salient attitudes in U.S. politics today. They were the most important attitudes that explained support for Donald Trump in 2016. And I haven't had a chance to look at any data for 2020, but I think here we can see the trends going through 2018 at least. They continue to sort of follow the trajectory from 2012 and 2016. So Americans have not become more racist. So what's happened? In a book that I published with Sanford Schramm last year, we argued basically that what's happened is what we're in the midst of has been a mainstreaming of white nationalism. And so we focus on white nationalists as right-wing extremists. I'll come back to at the very end just to say something about the anti-government groups. But anyhow, what's been happening for the last several years is that white nationalists, and to some extent their right-wing extremist anti-government sort of cousins, have engaged in a strategy of mainstreaming, when by that what we mean is the movement of the extremist activists and their ideology from the fringe to the political mainstream. Now, the strategy here, I want to say that this is an explicit strategy to some extent on the part of right-wing extremist leaders. And the strategy of mainstreaming actually is sort of captured, sort of the logic of it is captured by this idea put forth by a guy named Joseph Overton, several years ago, which has since been called the Overton window of political possibilities. And so you see there's a quote here, I won't read it, from Richard Spencer, the man who coined the term alt-right, one of the most prominent, well-known white nationalist figures in US politics today. And he makes it very clear that the strategy here is one of explicitly trying to move ideas that are considered extreme and not in the mainstream into the mainstream, or what is, the Overton window. That's the window there that Overton was talking about, the window of possibilities, political possibilities, where ideas are likely then to become translated into public policy. And so how does that happen? It happens by simply presenting your ideas in mainstream venues and mainstream forums. And it also helps that you present yourself as mainstream as well. And so what we've seen then is sort of this transition of, sort of right-wing extremists and particularly white nationalists from, these images on the left to images on the right. That's Richard Spencer there, who started or heads a policy think tank, he would call it, called the National Policy Institute, as his vehicle for advancing his white nationalist goals. There's a political party that formed. It's very small, hasn't had much of a significant impact, but some white nationalists have tried to get involved in electoral politics. And there, of course, are a number of forums that appear to be rather mainstream. This is one of the most prominent white nationalist sort of quote unquote intellectual forums where white nationalist ideas are promoted. And even on college campuses, we see this mainstream. College campuses actually have been targeted by white nationalist groups to try to indoctrinate white students. And they do so using the same kind of sort of softer strategy of presenting themselves as more mainstream and disguising their objectives. Real quickly, because I know I'm close to my time, in the book we show that there have been kind of two major waves of mainstreaming. Donald Trump being the most recent and the most significant. He did this, it was an explicit strategy, oftentimes through explicit racial appeals, but oftentimes through more implicit appeals. And there have been some important consequences. One of them is that if you actually track the activity of white nationalist groups, the most extreme groups, the ones we call in the book white supremacist groups, they've actually declined significantly over time. It actually started during the Obama presidency with the Tea Party mobilization and continued through the Trump era. So all these images that we've seen of white nationalists and discussion of white nationalists, the prominence of white nationalists in American politics, is not because there are more people who are racist and there are more white supremacist groups. It's because they have moved into mainstream politics and have felt more emboldened to sort of express themselves. We measure this in the electorate, and we show that people who we label as racially extreme, we call them racial extremists, based on attitudes toward Blacks, Latino immigrants, and Muslims in the US, supported Donald Trump at record levels compared to previous Republican candidates. There you can see the sort of the racial extremists, 95% of them roughly supported Donald Trump in 2016. And we identify another group called racial conservatives whose views are not quite as extreme, but we see the same significant shift there. And if you're wondering what percentage of Trump voters, I always get this question, would be classified as racial extremists. Well, we computed that, and it was in 2016, and it was 22%. So finally, what does the future hold? Trump lost, he's gone, yet he's still on the scene. One of the things that happened during the pandemic that was really interesting is that there was a significant mobilization of these anti-government groups They now became also part of the sort of extreme right constituency that Trump explicitly tried to appeal to. They were involved in the Capitol, riots that happened back in January. More of them, I think, than what we would call white nationalists. Trump is gone. What will Republicans do? They're staying loyal to Trump. You may have heard of Marjorie Taylor Greene. There was actually an effort that she made to try to put in some white nationalist language into sort of the founding document for caucus that she's forming with some other Republicans. There may be a third party. Where would it come from? We're not sure. That doesn't usually work well in American politics, but I think the point is that this constituency continues to be mobilized and will continue to play an important role in American politics. To some extent, what Trump does will have an effect on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is quite interesting and very informative. And I'm sure the question if there will be a third party will remain still next presidential election. So let's close this session with Ioanna Costarella about misinformation, echo chambers, and political polarization. Ioanna is also a professor at our faculty of the Department of Media and Journalism.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank very much the organizers and especially Professor Papageorgiou for his kind invitation to share some points regarding misinformation, disinformation, echo chambers, and political polarization. It is important to say that the term fake news became mainstream during the 2016 US election campaign when hundreds of websites published falsified or heavily biased stories, many of them in the pursuit of capitalizing on social media. The term fake news, popularized by the former President Donald Trump, is so prevalent now that it is hard to believe that just a few years ago, the term was barely used. Along with the term fake news, the usage of the concept of post-truth has increased. When we refer to post-truth, we define it as a relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than what appeals to emotion and personal belief. The 2020 US presidential election saw a number of false claims alleging election fraud and arguing that Donald Trump was the actual winner of the election. For months leading to the US presidential election, all these false claims about potential voter fraud have been common on the political right, as research shows. So Trump himself was responsible for some of the false and misleading claims about the prevalence of election fraud in the US, and all these have led to Trump being banned from a number of online platforms after his supporters stormed the United States Capitol building on January the 6th. So some examples of misinformation. When we talk about misinformation, we refer to information that is false or inaccurate or misleading according to Word. And some of the examples and the false claims that appeared on the media agenda were that voting machines fraudulently switched votes to Biden, or that large numbers of Trump ballots were destroyed, or that Republican election officials were unduly restricted from observing the polling stations. I will share just an example here about the travel of a misleading post. This is a map of voting in the state of Michigan that wrongly showed an increase of over 1 138,000 votes for Joe Biden, and at the same time, no additional votes for President Trump. The screenshot was real, but it contained incorrect information. To simply put it, it was a data entry error. The company which posted the maps said that it was a simple error from a file created by the state. And even though the error was corrected, it provided fertile social media content in an environment where unfounded allegations of voter fraud were gaining attendance and traction. So the earliest trace found of the map being used to allege some types of fraud was on the website 8kun, previously known as 8chan, on Wednesday, the 4th of November. 8kun is a message board filled with extreme language and views and contains violence and extreme sexual content. It is popular with far-right activists and believers in the QAnon conspiracy theory. So less than a half an hour later, the map found a way onto Twitter. It was posted by several profiles. A profile, for example, named Pepe the Frog, with having the frog image, very popular one, headed. And again, the post strongly hinted that some kind of fraud or trick was to blame rather than a data entry error. So the role of social media in amplifying fake news has been documented in a number of occasions. Some fear that democratic society is at risk because personalized content and services limit the diversity of media content people are exposed to. So the echo chamber, a filter bubble, becomes a unique universe of information for each of us. And this is realized through self-selected personalization. That is when people choose to encounter like-minded opinions exclusively, and through pre-selected personalization driven by websites, advertisers, often without the user's deliberate choice. So what are the effects on democracy? People who are repeatedly exposed to biased information that favors a particular political standpoint that is close to their own will eventually develop more extreme positions and be less tolerant regarding opposite views. Fewer common experiences means less social glue and more partisan polarization. According to a research by Pennycook and Trant, Trump voters who were more politically knowledgeable and focused on election news held more false beliefs, whereas those who were more reflective had more accurate beliefs. Yet analytic thinking was associated with more accurate beliefs about the election outcome among Trump's voters. These results speak to the ongoing debate about whether cognitive sophistication is associated with increased political polarization or increased accuracy, highlighting to the need to differentiate between political knowledge and analytic thinking. Recent research findings confirm that the consequences of fake news cannot be examined in isolation. To effectively anticipate the implications of misinformation spread, research needs to consider the current media and political environment. So we need more digital literacy. We need more transparency regarding the algorithms and the profiling practices. This is an important parameter that we should take under consideration. And finally, there is a great need for education in algorithm literacy, and those who design algorithms should be trained in ethics and required to design code that considers societal impacts. Thank you very much. I hope I was brief enough.
Thank you, Joanna. We close the first session. There will be some questions and answers. Ioannis, how it works? I mean, everybody can ask something.
If I may, we have the possibility, all participants have the possibility to ask in writing questions through the Q&A. Normally you will see, for all of you, you will see a Q&A button on the right hand, bottom right hand. You can write a Q&A and then the chair will announce the questions. So, and of course, panelists can also comment on each other, whoever wants to come in first. So, Chair, you have the control.
Nobody asks anything, but anyway, if somebody wants to say something, I think we have something like 15 minutes, but anyway, if somebody want to ask something, he can or she can write it to the questions and answer.
If I can take an oral question to Richard, I think mostly. At some point, Richard, in your, I mean, this is more general, but at some point at your presentation, you mentioned that, in fact, it was not an increase on supremacism, but it was more a visible expression of that. So there was a sort of suppressed or hidden racism or discrimination, if you want. I don't want to use the term racism. There was an element of persistent discrimination at the United States level which came out, or was it something that has increased because of more significant presence of different races at many areas because of the fear of the white? So is it a new element, or is it a new expression, if I may express it myself?
Yes, it's a new expression is what I would say. It's the backlash is more of a mobilization, and a mobilization into mainstream politics is mostly how I see it. In terms of attitudes, what you don't find now, there wasn't, if you look at those graphs, you can see, if you go back prior to 2016, you can see, at least on the among Republicans, there was a bit of a long-term increase in hostility toward these different racial outgroups. But I guess so, but it wasn't super significant, and certainly there wasn't an increase in racial hostility moving from 2012 to 2016, even 2018. What you do see, though, is an increase in the association or the correlation between racial hostility and political sort of electoral participation and vote choice. And by electoral participation, I mean not just voting, but also involvement in the campaign. In 2016, you see an increase in anger toward the Democratic Party among those who are, exhibit these sort of racially extremist views, racial prejudice. So it's that we believe and argue that the anger, and a lot of it started with the campaign and then election of Barack Obama. One of the most prominent, probably the most prominent white supremacist in recent American history is a man named David Duke. And when Obama was running for office, he stated that Obama in an interview, he stated that Obama would be the best recruiting tool for the white supremacist movement that they've ever had. And indeed, he was, but that mobilization sort of quickly was channeled into more mainstream venues because there just became an increasing impatience within the movement, an impatience in seeing results. And so they wanted results, and many, not all, but many people within the movement, many people who hold these racially extremist views, felt that it would be better to sort of compromise maybe on some of their extremist views and to be able to have someone who was at least somewhat sympathetic elected to office. And Donald Trump really fit the bill, and that's why so many white nationalist leaders and groups endorsed him in 2016. Now, Trump did not follow through as much as they would have liked. I think George was kind of making that point. And in fact, Richard Spencer, I saw somewhere, actually endorsed Joe Biden. But that's only because there are some people who believe that for the sort of race revolution to happen in the United States, we need to go further left, and then that's when whites will wake up. And so there's sort of a theory about that. But if you look at sort of mass attitude, at least in 2018, Trump still had the support, same level of support among racial extremists.
Okay, Yanis Stavrakakis pointed that the question around mainstreaming of far right is also actively researched in Europe. And also we have two questions for Yanis, Andreadis, and George Halley. John Karamoustos asks, saying, I would like to ask if America is not such a polarized country as the data indicates, what caused those conflicts between citizens? Is his question. So I see also a question, who is the essential winner of the election? Biden, actually. The Sanders wing or the mainstream Democrats? It's a general question, but as I may say that Biden is the winner. So Yanis and George,
may I start?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
First of all, I don't think that the data that I have presented show that United States are such a strongly polarized nation. In fact, what I have presented is that Greece is even more polarized than United States, both on the ideological dimension and on this affected polarization dimension. However, I would say that yes, there is up to a significant level strong polarization within the US electorate. And this is very clear from questions that unfortunately are not part of the CSCS. Maybe they should be in one of the following modules. For instance, it is typical of this affected polarization. A typical example of this affected polarization in the United States is this unwillingness between the American citizens of getting married with someone from the opposing party. So I have just yesterday, I think I saw one new publication among students in a politics department course, and although they were the students who participated in the survey, they said that they would not have a problem if someone in their family would marry someone of the opposing party. They would not marry themselves someone from the opposing party. So, in fact, there is some polarization. This is a typical example, I think, of affected polarization. that we have not seen in Greece, or at least we're not able to measure it yet. And I hope we can do this in the future. Thank you.
George?
The only thing I would add to that is the degree to which American politics is polarized, I think, is in part due to the degree to which American politics has become identity politics by sort of another name. That is, our political parties are increasingly, a key part of our social identities. And that's where we see strange results of people saying that, oh, I wouldn't marry somebody who belongs to the other political party. And so there's this, in a sense, Americans kind of launder other types of identity through their political parties, and because being prejudiced against Democrats, being prejudiced against Republicans is still an acceptable prejudice. So I think that that's part of what's going on here, is that some of our other sort of latent hostilities are being sort of channeled into partisan politics, and in a sense making our politics more toxic than they necessarily have to be. That said, I'm sort of allergic to alarmism. So when we talk about these conflicts between citizens, I mean, let's keep things in perspective. When people say, oh, America has never been more polarized, I don't know. I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, in a sense, we've always been polarized, but it's always about something different things. So I'm not in a panic about any of the trends that I'm looking at right now.
Okay, there is another question for you, George. Somebody, Elias, I don't know, it doesn't matter, asks, what will be the best strategy for Republican candidates in the next presidential election to follow? Mimicking Trump or trying to create a new symbolism? Saying
this
that...
is oh, sorry.
Yes, okay.
This is the problem for all Republicans with an eye on 2024. They know that if they want to, capture Trump's energy, they have to present themselves as sort of the heir apparent to Trump. That, you've got people like, say, Josh Hawley, who, he's tried to build a brand as being sort of like a smarter Trump. I don't think it's worked at all. I don't think he has a chance. We have DeSantis in Florida, who I think does have a viable shot at sort of taking that Trump energy. But the problem is that none of this works if Trump runs. That is, you can't present yourself as being the new Trump and build that as your brand, and then simultaneously run against Trump successfully, because what would be your argument against Trump and why he shouldn't be the nominee? That's why I say that the election belongs to Trump if he wants it, for the Republican nomination anyway. Because as Liz Cheney has discovered, there is no constituency for an anti-Trump Republican, except, you can get lots of media appearances, but nobody wants to vote for that within the Republican Party in any numbers. So the strategy, I think, for any Republican right now who's looking to run for the presidency is, try to win over Trump supporters and hope he doesn't run in 2024. Otherwise, you have to wait.
Okay, thank you. And there is also a question for Fording, for Professor Fording. Let me say, the question is, if all the three aforementioned groups share a common characteristic about Christian nationalism or not? What do you think, Professor Fording?
Sure. No, that's a good question. And in terms of the white nationalist movement, it's actually itself a rather diverse group. And what unites them all is sort of this shared strong sense of white identity. And for some of those groups, that white identity does mean white Christian identity. But for some of those groups, it's not. I couldn't put a number or percentage maybe on, how that's sort of been traditional. That is, the Ku Klux Klan, for example, is a good example of Christianity being extremely tied into white identity, sort of white Anglo Western identity. But I'd say, not necessarily as much, especially you get into the neo-Nazi sort of inspired white nationalists, white supremacists, and the alt-right. I would suggest, or I would think maybe not so much, George.
Open your microphone.
That's correct. If we think about the sort of the leading voices of the alt-right back in its heyday, it was overwhelmingly secular, if not overtly hostile to Christianity. Historically within the American white supremacist movement, there's been a lot of ambivalence towards Christianity. Some of it going back to sort of the Nietzschean perspective of it being a slave morality, and some of it being critical of some of the inescapable egalitarian aspects of Christian theology, which a lot of racial extremists wish to expunge from the movement.
Okay, so a very interesting question for Professor Costarella, for Ioanna. Would you say that fake news now have lost their power as everyone now is aware of the possibility of fake news?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can also combine it to the other one that I see here in the Q&A session regarding the fact that if Trump's real legacy, if you perform in an unhinged way, this will get you to people's homes. I would say that we need more research on how fake news travel. We know that fake news travel faster than news themselves. According to the MIT research on 2018, it is 6 to 7 times faster. So we need more research on how fake news travel, but also to what their psychological and cognitive effects are. So how people perceive them. I wouldn't say that they lost their power, because if I may call them traditional fake news we have encountered so far maybe now be known, but we now have deep fakes. We have the contribution of AI in the construction of fake news. So we should shed light to the construction of deep fakes and how the artificial intelligence will make this kind of fake news have more impact.
Okay, thank you. And final question to Yannis Andreadis. Is the ideological polarization in US based on a measurement of ideological self-labeling, or it is based on measures of preferences on policy issues or on something else? Yannis?
Yes, CSS has a series of questions that ask respondents to position parties on the left-right scale. So this is the main source of this index. What is common to do is to use these responses of the participants as to use them as experts. So the average position of each party is used as the position of each party. And then I'm using the typical way that has been used in many publications, and the first time it was suggested by Dalton back in 2008. So this is how it is calculated. So this polarization, left-right polarization, is in fact the weighted distance of the parties from the mean position of the electorate.
Yes, it is. It's an ongoing discussion how to measure polarization or how to measure the ideologically polarized people, what is the meaning of left, right, and so on. But we will have the opportunity to talk about it in several occasions. Thank you all for being in this seminar and hearing all these interesting talks, and I'm sure we will continue with more interesting things. So let's have a break for 5 to 10 minutes and continue with the second.
5 minutes. I mean, we start at 7:30 if possible.
Okay, 5 minutes. It doesn't matter. I mean, and now, okay, let's say in 5 minutes, in 7:30 or 11:30 or 10:30. 11:30, isn't it? In Alabama, it is 11:30.
Yes, it'll be 11:30.
Okay. Lucky you.
Thank you all for your interesting interventions. 5 minutes break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fionis, I'm ready to start. Okay. Welcome back. That was a very, very interesting first session, and I think we will have more interesting talks coming up. Our second session is on long-term issues in US politics. We have 5 presenters who are going to talk. We have our total session length is 55 minutes for this second one. And so we will ask the speakers to stick with a 7-minute limit if you can. We will just begin and go in the order that the presenters are listed on the program. The first presenter is Professor Regina Wagner. She is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Alabama. Professor Wagner's research interests include political representation, gender and politics, legislative politics, and political parties. And she will be speaking about bipartisanship in the American political system. So please go ahead, Professor Wagner.
Thank you. Yeah, so I don't have slides, so I will just be talking without slides. But yeah, so I'm going to say a little bit about bipartisanship in general, and then I guess at the end I have a few thoughts on what does this mean in the current sort of political moment. So as I'm sure you all know, the US political system is basically built with a great need for bipartisanship. You have so many sort of choke points and veto points, especially in the Senate. Then you have a presidential system which allows for divided government, which a lot of parliamentary systems don't have. And you have a system that essentially forces you to have just 2 parties. So in that sense, you end up with a situation where you will not get a lot done. And you have a lot of things that grind to a halt if there isn't at least a base level of bipartisanship. So it's sort of formulated or created with that in mind. And the question is, you know, where do we stand today with respect to that, and what does that mean? There's also the element that voters often say that they want more bipartisanship, right? So in a lot of surveys, you will see people complaining that Congress doesn't get anything done, that there's gridlock. Then they vote in a way that creates more gridlock, but that's a different issue. But a lot of voters do, and you know, as we heard earlier, do actually profess or hold moderate views, and they say they support bipartisanship, but they don't actually, especially the well-informed voters, don't actually want their side to compromise. So you have the situation where the people who are most likely to vote in primaries are the people who are least supportive of your party actually compromising with the other side. So if you are an elected official, the incentives are to be less compromising, to be less bipartisan, because the primary voters will actually punish you for that. So there's sort of that dynamic that's going on. So primaries are one of the sort of first pieces or first elements that will actually lead to a decreased willingness to bipartisanship and compromise on the part of elected officials, right? So that is sort of one thing that works against bipartisanship. The other thing that works against this is that you have 2 parties that have become more ideologically homogenous over time. Elected officials, Republican elected officials, have become sort of more conservative. Elected Democrats have become more liberal, sort of in their views, but also as a group, right? So they've moved further apart. And you've ended up with districts that have become more red and more blue, and fewer purple and swing districts, right? So this is also something that will create a situation where you have a relatively low general election punishment for being far to the left or far to the right. But there is a primary, a punishment threat in the primary for not being far to the left or far to the right enough, right? So you're creating that, that situation. And then your second piece that you have here, besides redistricting and primaries in general, is basically the demise of what was the Southern Democratic Party, right? So you had a Democratic Party that was basically made up of two parties under the umbrella of one, right? You had the Northern Democratic Party, and you had the entire South up until the mid-90s that was Democratic, but they were not liberal, right? So you had sort of a very internally sort of diverse party, and you always ended up in situations where you had to you had three pieces in Congress, and you had to have at least two that worked together, right? You had to be either you had to get Northern and Southern Democrats on board, or one of those two factions had to get Republicans, right? So you had, and then to get anything done, that was sort of a force towards bipartisanship, because the Democratic Party was not sort of internally homogenous in an ideological sense, and because that meant that they were always in the majority, right? For several decades up until the 90s, the House was basically consistently controlled by Democrats. So if you were the Republicans, that was also an incentive, right? There was sort of that, that element there. And then finally, that went away. And the final piece you had is that the Republican Party essentially radicalized during the Obama years. So we talked about the rise of the Tea Party, and that was one thing that they were fairly successful in primaries. And so you had a lot of elected Republicans that either lost or that decided that they needed to be more in line with what the Tea Party was demanding in order to not lose. So they moved far to the right in their ideological positions. And a lot of times that means you have to signal that you are not working with the other side. So there are a lot of sort of pieces that are working against bipartisanship. But despite all of that, despite sort of the increase in polarization on the, on the elite level and sort of that increase of heatedness of the political debate, it is still true that the majority of legislation that's passed is passed with bipartisan support. Right, so the majority of bills are still not passed along party lines. They still get support from the minority party. It's just true that landmark legislation, high-profile legislation, has decreased in its bipartisan support, has become more polarized, has become more sort of contentious, and that's what we talk about the most, right? Those are the most influential and the most important pieces of legislation. What has also become less bipartisan is the confirmation of Supreme Court justices. So that's another element where you used to see, up until the early 2000s, people get confirmed with 90+ votes in the Senate. And ever since sort of the second half of the Obama presidency, that hasn't happened. And it's become starkly partisan, and there's become sort of a stark decrease in bipartisanship there. So to sort of finish this up, the last part of what I want to talk about is what does this mean for the Biden era, right? The post-Trump era. Joe Biden, interestingly, campaigned on bipartisanship, right? That was one of his big things. He wants to bring bipartisanship back. He talked about how he was able to work with the Republicans when he was in the Senate. And then after he became president, he and his administration quickly changed the meaning of bipartisanship from working with congressional Republicans to implementing policies that are popular with Republicans and Democrats in the electorate, right? That's a very different meaning of, you can say that that's bipartisan, but that sort of is a very different sort of interpretation of that. And that's partially because his first major policy package, which was the COVID relief bill in March, actually it had to pass the Senate under budget reconciliation rules, which means you only need 51 vote majority, because they couldn't get Republican support, right? And so that was, as I said, one of the examples for those landmark legislation pieces that have become very sort of partisan. Now going forward, the issue with this is that one of their own senators, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, has in fact said he does not support using reconciliation rules for other major legislation pieces like infrastructure, immigration, or voting rights, and that has to be passed in a bipartisan manner. And he's in fact proposed a sort of alternative voting rights bill to the one that passed in the House. And he said he can get Republican support. Now he's going to have to find 10 Republicans to support this. And I think that sort of is a test of where things stand, right? If this approach of bipartisanship that Joe Manchin has in mind is working under the current situation in the Senate, and the question is what he would do and what that means for leadership, Democratic leadership in the White House, but also in Congress, if he fails, right? If he can't find, if even he cannot find Republicans to support that, or enough Republicans to support that. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say about this. I don't know how long this was, but I hope it wasn't more than 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I think it was on time. As we go along, I want to invite attendees, anyone out there, you can submit questions through the Q&A, and we'll get to those questions after the scheduled presenters. Our next presenter is Professor Yannis Papageorgiou. He's Associate Professor of International and European Politics at Aristotle University and holds the Jean Monnet Chair on Fundamentals of European Integration. His research deals with supranational government, supranational government, current political systems, and migration and refugee policies. He's going to discuss whether the US political system is becoming more European. So go ahead, please.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks a lot for the coordination of the panel. You will have to interrupt me because among the other things, I forgot my watch as well. I wanted to, I have a PowerPoint, but I don't want to use it because I want to go faster without a PowerPoint. My question, my subject is whether the US political system is becoming more European. Perhaps I should rephrase it. Should the US political system become more European? And I explain myself. As Regina just said, the concept of the American political system was based on bipartisanship and on the divided government. The founding fathers and the political system loathed factionalism. They loathed factionalism in the sense of what we call today political parties, or rather disciplined political parties. For Madison in his Federalist Paper 10, political parties were adverse to the rights of other citizens, and they were against the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So the beginning of the, I don't want to say it problem, but the beginning of the issue arises with the fact that parties in the United States remained to a large extent a conception, an evil that we had to contain rather than an expression of an ideologically coherent group of citizens. This is to a large extent linked to the structure of the American political system. But today the US parties are, I think already someone mentioned that, there are a paradox. They are present everywhere, they are massive, they are important in the political system, but at the same time, they look like European parties of the 19th century. They are more like-minded organizations than politically coherent, ideologically coherent institutions. They lack often leadership, and very, very much they don't have, or they did not have till recently, a political platform. On the other hand, as Europeans developed the concept of parties and the concept of political, of majoritarian democracy in the 20th century especially. And today for us, it is hard to envisage a representative government unless it is in terms of unified political parties. This was the situation in the States till the beginning of the 21st century. Perhaps, I don't know when ideology became a significant element in US politics. I would link it to the Tea Party movement, but perhaps it is even earlier. But this gradually increased party voting unity in the Congress. And partisanship is not only in the Congress, you can gradually see it at citizens level as well. We see that in terms of governmental level, there is a legislative gridlock. Most legislation, as Regina said, do still pass on a bipartisan level, but it is few, very little compared to European standards. Legislation in the United States is in numbers limited. It is more important, but it is limited. There are lots of bills that are stalled. There are also legislative proposals that are sort of taken away from the agenda because the proponents are not in line with the majority of the party. And we see also political obstructionism. Remember, I just have to remind Merrick Garland's non-confirmation by the Senate in 2016. And again, Regina referred to the Supreme Court justices. I'm not sure, I haven't read the data on other circuit courts nominations. I don't think that we have many bipartisan circuit court nominations. It also becomes important at citizens level. Again, in primaries, citizens become more cognizant of enforced party loyalty. They tend to give a premium to party loyalty, even against the capacity to have someone elected. And this creates a vicious circle of increased party loyalty, which enhances at the same time party discipline and probably stifles real bipartisanship at political level. It is a process that is ongoing, I think, and it shows that the United States moves towards a more majoritarian political system, which was something that the founding fathers wanted to avoid at all costs. But and we see that this implies a more disciplined voting pattern among more voters. There is much less split ticket voting nowadays. People vote Democrats for all elections. People vote Republicans for all elections. There is hardly, very little, or let's say in exceptional cases, you can have persons voting for two different parties. I think that in the recent elections, there was only Maine which voted differently for the senator and the president. That had to do a lot with the personality of Susan Collins. Even again, Regina spoke about West Virginia. Joe Manchin is trying to stick to an increasingly perilous seat, whereby in a way reducing to a large extent his democratic credentials. And this clashes very much with the concepts of a divided government. Now, if you go back to the European majoritarian democracies, you will see that we have managed to maintain the rule of the majority with the right of control from minorities. This includes a number of issues. For instance, one important aspect which has not been discussed in the United States is the depoliticization of the electoral process. United States is the last major democracy where registration of voters does not take place automatically, or at the federal level. In most European states, the electoral process is depolitized with boundary commissions, with an independent process, an independent and neutral process of registration of voters. There is a wider consensus on rights.
Jonas, about 1 more minute.
And there is a wider consensus on main policies. Now, what can we do in the United States in this 1 minute that I have? One thing, looking at the European examples, electoral reform. Majority system is stifling the differentiations. Should we have more parties? Should we have other parties? Again, Regina spoke about that. Further action at federal level, bipartisanship or bipartisan or independent boundary commissions. And I would not be scared to get rid of the filibuster. I mean, it is important that policies are taken by the majority and the majority takes the responsibility for that. Again, there is an increased, there is also the possibility to bureaucratize or agencify politics. That has been used at European level as well successfully. All that requires a new constitutional arrangement, and that is a very big if. And with that, I close, and I'm sorry if I went beyond my time. Thank you very much.
Now, that was very good. Thank you. And very, you hit it right on time. So thank you. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Steve Borelli. Dr. Borelli is a professor of political science at the University of Alabama. His research interests focused on the institutions of the American national government, including the makeup and organization of Congress, elections, public opinion, and the programs of political parties. Professor Borelli is going to talk about the role of political elites. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, yes. So I got a very broad, or I volunteered for a very broad topic to talk about. And perhaps unwisely, rather than trying to narrow it down, I thought I would take a very broad view of the subject. So I've got a lot of stuff to talk about. Let's see how much I can get through. Can everybody see that? So I will say I am not a political theorist, so I'm not going to try to come up with or utilize a consistent, definition of what I mean by a political elite. I decided to kind of go with the different ways that the term political elite's been used, either by people who study American politics or in kind of American political rhetoric by politicians themselves. Okay, so in political science, there's a tendency sometimes to call people who know a lot about politics and who have fairly integrated belief systems, to call them elites. So these are citizens, but they just happen to be more informed than other citizens. Okay, so sometimes that's the way elites has been used. Often in political rhetoric, we hear politicians talking about career politicians, right? Populist politicians often criticize or excoriate, people who've been reelected for 20 or 30 years and who are kind of permanent inhabitants of Washington. Another way that political elites can be talked about is in terms of people who hold institutional positions, party leaders in Congress or party leaders in the political parties, okay? Another way that political elites have been talked about, usually negatively in populist rhetoric, is talking about the unelected bureaucrats who actually run the government, who actually make policy in most democratic systems and non-democratic systems. Okay, what Trump called the deep state, right? People who are, who continue to hold their positions regardless of politics or regardless of the administration in power. Populists on the left, of course, when they talk about elites, they talk about people with lots of money or corporations, and all that. Not only do they hold economic power, but their money also gives them political power through political donations and political spending. So these are all the different ways in which we can identify elites in the American political system. So I thought what I would do is kind of compare the relative power of elites in the American political system, defined all these ways, say about 15 years ago to what it is now. Because part of the populist manifesto on both the left and the right is to reduce the power of political elites. So let's see how much the apparent political power of elites has been reduced in the US, say over the last 15 years, okay? 15 years ago, if I was giving this talk, I would say that elites of all kinds are fully in charge of American politics, okay? The political science research seemed to indicate that most ordinary citizens get their opinions from political elites, right? They watch the people that they take cues from, politicians or just highly informed citizens that they know, and they adopt those political positions, okay? That it was very rare for the average citizen to actually come up with their own views on political issues. It was mostly elite driven. Most political realignments in this country were seen to have been led by elites. Okay. When it comes to experienced politicians, it seemed like experienced politicians were still quite secure in American politics, right? There was still an incumbency advantage in getting elected to Congress. Even non-incumbent candidates for Congress, the ones who did best, who were most likely to get elected, were the ones who had the most previous elective office experience, okay? In the Obama administration, the George W. Bush administration, it seemed like the cabinet and the White House staff were all very experienced people. Party leaders seemed to wield a lot of power 15 years ago in the US Congress, right? They were the ones who formulated legislative proposals. They enforced party discipline. And when it came to nomination of presidential candidates, a book was published in 2009 that made the argument that even though primaries had tried to democratize the nomination system, party elites still played a major role, if not the determining role, in who the presidential nominees would be. Therefore, we get nominees like Robert Dole or Mitt Romney, right? Very, very much kind of party insiders, party elites, okay? And despite presidents' attempts to politicize the bureaucracy, career civil servants seem to continue to wield a lot of power in American government. Although to me, you know, the politicization is the trend that's been going on the longest, that ever since at least Richard Nixon, we've seen a systematic effort by presidents of both parties to exert more political control over the career civil service. And then finally, you know, inequality was a big issue 15 years ago, as it is now. And there was a lot of political science research on inequality in the 2000s that suggested that wealthy citizens are actually more likely to get their views represented by public policy than ordinary citizens. Okay, so we do see what looks to be a populist revolt happening within the last 15 years. And there's lots of reasons for that, some of which we've talked about today, including changes in technology, you know, the impact of the Great Recession, right? The discrediting of experts, right? Knowledgeable people or powerful people due to the policy disasters that were occurring. We've seen, you know, increased racial incidents in American politics. And of course, all this culminates in Trump's ability to win the presidential nomination in 2016, despite not having the endorsement of any major political elites within his party. He would soon get their endorsements, sometimes reluctant, but he started his quest for the presidency as sort of a joke, as somebody who, under an elite controlled system, couldn't possibly win the nomination, okay? And once he became president, he brought, you know, definite outsiders into the inner circle of decision-making in the White House. And of course, over the last year, there's been a lot of discussion about elites and elite influence during the COVID pandemic. Do people listen to what either career experts say or to what our elected leaders say about what we should or should not be doing when it comes to mitigating the COVID pandemic? So where do we stand today? Okay. Well, it still seems like most of the general public do get their political opinions from elites. But I would argue that the nature and the diversity of those elites has really changed, right? That more different kinds of people with more different kinds of views are opinion leaders compared to what would have been the case 15 years ago, in part because of, you know, the proliferation of political opinion and information on the internet. Recent research does suggest that incumbency and previous office experience does not matter as much in the most recent congressional elections as it did 15, 20 years ago. That the so-called incumbency effect is now mainly an effect that, well, if you happen to run in a district where your party is the dominant party, you will win. But any added value you get simply because you've held office before has diminished almost to the vanishing point. Among non-incumbent members of Congress, right, you're seeing more amateur candidates run successfully for office. You know, so previous elective office experience is no longer as important in who gets elected to Congress. With party leaders in Congress, it's kind of the best of times and the worst of times. You still have what seems to be a very leadership-centric Congress, right, where policy will not get made without, you know, the speaker, the minority leader, majority leader, et cetera. However, the extent to which those party leaders are being held accountable by the base of their party, I think, has increased. Okay, the Cheney episode demonstrates very well. Kevin McCarthy was forced to sort of recant some of what he'd said about President Trump's responsibility for the insurrection and about the elections when it became clear that they could no longer tolerate a vocal anti-Trump person within the Republican leadership. So what does it say about leadership? In this case, it's leadership responding to the base of their party, right? Rather than exercising what we
about out of time, so.
Okay, all right. When it comes to economic inequality, obviously that's still a problem. Although there is some very recent evidence suggesting, A, that money doesn't matter as much. For example, Trump was outspent vastly by Hillary Clinton in 2016. And there's also evidence suggesting that inexperienced candidates are doing a better job at raising money than in the past. Thank you for your patience and attention.
Okay, thank you very much. And Steve, you'll unshare.
Okay. Let me get
Your screen.
stop share.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So next, I am going to share some thoughts on the Constitution and the role that the Constitution, certain elements of the Constitution play in, that strike me as important in the present sort of constitutional, or the present moment. Just to introduce myself, I'm Joe Smith. I'm the professor and a chair of the University of Alabama Department of Political Science. I'm going to be talking about how popular preferences are translated into power within American political institutions. And I'll reveal the conclusion now. I foresee more unsettled times ahead for American politics. To say that the Constitution is an obstacle to democratic governance is in some ways not controversial. Conventional explanation for the design choices made by the framers of the Constitution stress that they purposefully designed a republic, not a democracy. One benefit of the Constitution, the story goes, is that our elected institutions filter out the unwise whims of the voters. Insulated as they are from immediate recall by the voters, senators, members of Congress, and presidents can ignore the ill-advised, liberty-invading preferences of the majority. The fragmented nature of our national government, which has been referenced a few times in the previous presentations, this fragmented nature with its separated institutions able to frustrate each other's initiatives further hampers the ability of popular majorities to control policy. The benefit of these inefficient processes is that they make the government less able to invade the liberties of the governed. However, these structures do more than slow down the political process and filter out bad ideas. They distort the way that the popular preferences are translated into power within political institutions. And by distortion, I mean a mismatch between the proportion of votes cast for the particular candidate, for the candidates of a particular political party, and the proportion of offices held by that party. The easiest example is the US Senate. The constitutional rule that each state gets 2 senators means that Wyoming and California have the same representation in the Senate, despite the fact that California has 68 times more people than Wyoming. On a national level, the 15 most populous states have about 2/3 of the nation's people, but only 30% of its senators. The Electoral College, through which the US president is chosen, distorts preferences along the same lines, though not as severely. Since US Supreme Court justices are appointed by the Senate and the president, the distortions in these bodies lead to similar distortions in the Supreme Court. The court is pivotal in many national policies that are sharply at odds with popular preferences, such as gun control, campaign finance restrictions, and abortion. A second type of distortion emerges from the fact that the Constitution allows states to set voting rules for national elections. The Constitution says that anyone eligible to vote for state officials is also eligible to vote in national elections. This means that individual states determine who is eligible to vote for members of Congress and the president, and how these elections will be conducted within certain broad restrictions. Dominant political parties within states can change voting rules to increase their own advantage. This power introduces or increases distortion in how popular preferences are translated into power in state institutions. And this power can be used for clear partisan purposes. In the last few months, 11 states, all with unified Republican control, that is of both the state legislatures and the governors, have implemented new restrictions on voting. State governments also control voting districts for national and state legislatures through gerrymandering, which is the strategic design of electoral districts to maximize a party's representation in the legislature. Gerrymandering is a very effective way of distorting the translation of popular preferences into legislative seats, and is done enthusiastically by both parties. The process of redrawing voting districts is done once every 10 years. Districts cannot be redrawn whenever a new party takes control of government, so that's a limit. So these facts about the Constitution and these processes about the Constitution have become more important, I think, now than they have been in the past. The facts have always been there, but they're exacerbated now by the polarization, distrust, and hostility between our major political parties and between the geographic organizations of the parties. So we're at a situation where most of the states are reliably controlled by one party or the other. Only 6 states currently have US senators from different parties. That is by far the lowest it's ever been. In only 1 state, Minnesota, are the 2 houses of the state legislature controlled by different parties. And 39 of the 50 states have unified control of state legislature and governor's offices. You add to that the fact that the parties, that the geographic bases of the parties are so different. Very broadly, rural and less populous states are dominated by the Republican Party, while states whose populations are concentrated in cities tend to be dominated by the Democratic Party, though there are important exceptions. This geographic breakdown is relatively recent in American politics, and it exceeds any kind of geographic breakdown or geographic distinctions that we've seen since the Civil War. Now, the other important element of this is that we can't change these things in the Constitution because the amendment process has exactly the same problems as the rest of our political system. So I think that we've got a real problem between, on the one hand, the Constitution's commitment to federalism, to allowing states to be important organizational factors for political decisions, and the current the polarization between political parties. And so I think this really has some problems. This to me suggests that we may have some real problems. States have largely formed themselves into different political teams. And these teams are largely, as George Hawley said earlier, they're about psychological commitment to a party name, not so much about commitment to policies, but that psychological commitment to a party label is very strong. And the teams distrust each other. This situation has led to states using their constitutional powers to try to undermine and disadvantage the opposing team. And as the populations that are advantaged and disadvantaged by these distortions increasingly perceive themselves to have different and irreconcilable political goals, and really to be different communities, I think what we've seen and what we're likely to continue to see is that they lose faith in political institutions as venues for resolving political questions. So I think the Constitution is a real problem. And I don't see a good outcome for this because it is so difficult for us to amend the Constitution. As you probably know, an amendment to the Constitution requires that 38 states ratify that amendment. That is essentially impossible for anything that would be a fundamental change. Okay, I will stop there. And our last speaker on this panel is Professor Yanis Stavrakakis. He is professor at the Department of Political Sciences of Aristotle University. His research primarily focuses on contemporary political theory with emphasis on psychoanalytic and post-structuralist approaches and on the analysis of ideology and discourse in late modern societies, with emphasis on populism, environmentalism, nationalism, and post-democracy. And he's going to talk about American populism then and now. So, Professor Stavrakakis, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to Professor Papageorgiou and to Joe and all our colleagues from the University of Alabama for organizing this challenging workshop. To connect a little bit with the previous panel, I would like to observe that polarization is not always bad. In fact, we had another collaboration with within the scope of research, an international research network run by Jennifer McCoy at Georgia State University, and together with Professor Andriadis, we have visited Atlanta also for a workshop before the pandemic. And this was about polarization, and one of the conclusions of this network was that we can have either benign or pernicious types of polarization. In fact, there are two special issues of journals, the American Behavioral Scientist and the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, in which most of the papers from this network are collected and demonstrate exactly that we can have different types of polarization. And I think with American populism, we can see both types in action, so to speak. So this is a significant example of both populism and polarization. Of course, it's a very long history from which we usually hear about the last episode only, which is Donald Trump. And we know Trump being discussed as populist, as an exemplary populist, in fact. And this resonates very much with the Eurocentric accounts of populism and of European far-right populism as well as a taboo concept. So the canon in this perspective is far-right, it's presented as far-right, very close to nativism, nationalism, and so on and so forth. And Trump seems to embody this image with an obscene twist, I would say. My fear is that here, if we adopt this perspective, certain peripheral, nearly rhetorical references which are used to camouflage hierarchical and anti-democratic ideologies are taken as proof of populism. And what is indirectly obscured is inclusionary, egalitarian, democratic type of populism, which exists in other places or have existed in the US 150 years ago. So clearly, I think a more nuanced take is needed. And what is more accurate, I would say, is the argument put forward by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart in their book Cultural Backlash, in which they say that they view Trump as a leader who uses populist rhetoric, but only to legitimize his style of governance while promoting authoritarian values that threaten the liberal norms undermining American democracy. So it's a little bit more nuanced than the outright identification of populism in general with Trump. So we are talking here about a veneer of people power. This is their wording. And the populist words of leaders such as Orban, Trump, etc., are the external patina disguising authoritarian practices. So it is the combination of authoritarian values disguised by populist rhetoric which is of interest in these particular cases. I think this analysis legitimizes the claim that an alternative approach is needed, flexible yet rigorous, to account for the different types of populism in the international arena and throughout history. For example, to give you a very contemporary example, now what is happening in Chile. If you remember in the beginning when we had the first demonstration, Pinera, the president of Chile, was out to denounce the populist uprising and so on and so forth. And now 80% is voting for a new constitution. So if we identify populism with Trump, what do we make of what's happening in Chile? This is my problem. And in fact, Norris and Inglehart point out that, and this is also the proposal by Mood and Kaltwasser as well, so it is part of the mainstream approach to populism at the moment, that populism can also be a corrective to democracy. It can encourage innovative forms of direct participation, highlight genuine public concerns regarding corruption, and so on and so forth, bring more people to politics, help reform movements, and so on and so forth. On the negative side, of course, when this is combined with authoritarian values, we have something like Trump, probably. So we need this more nuanced approach. And I think that what helps understand that this is what we need is also if we combine, when we study American politics, if we study together Trump with American populism of the 1890s, which was a very to my mind, it was a very progressive movement. It was an attempt to create something beyond the Democratic and the Republican Party, which were dominant back then as well. It was the continuation of the Farmers Alliance, which was a very broad cooperative movement. It only got 8-9% in the presidential elections of 1892. It was very short-lived, but by most accounts, both the original, the first historiographical accounts in the 20th century and also recent accounts, there's a big bibliography, Michael Kazin, Lawrence Goodwin, Charles Postel, Walter Nugget, for anybody who wants to study this movement. So this was a largely egalitarian, progressive movement. I don't have the time to go into the policy at the moment, but we should study them in order to get a better grasp of the nuances and the complexities of populism, because this is lost when we concentrate on phenomena like Trump or European far-right populism and so on and so forth. Of course, there was a resignification, historical resignification in the 50s with Richard Hofstadter and modernization theories and pluralists who thought that this is not correct, that this was very bad and it was anti-Semitic and it was backward-looking and things like that. And I think this is where most of the stereotypes that still haunt populism research internationally emanate from. But I mentioned all the recent literature that adopts a much more positive account. Conclusion, nuances need to be preserved and highlighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's been very interesting. I feel like we've had some expressions that can talk to each other. We do have a couple of questions in the question and answer. I'll start with one for Regina Wagner. The question is, what do you think of the idea sometimes called the top two primary or nonpartisan blanket primary? And does this have a potential to increase bipartisanship?
I can say a little bit about this. I think generally people often think it does. And so there are some moves towards nonpartisan primaries or these top two primaries. I think really the only thing that would have this effect is if more people voted in primaries, because the real problem isn't that they are partisan primaries, it's that such a small percentage of partisans votes in them, and the ones that do vote in them tend to be the more extreme parts of their own base, right? And so what you really would want is to just increase the number of people who vote in those primaries, and then you would then they'd function more in the way that I think people imagined that they would function when they were when they were introduced as that sort of democratizing element.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? If not, I can move on to another question. This is a question, we have two questions that are somewhat similar, and they both ask about, or they ask about sort of the future of American politics given bipartisanship and given the structures that we have. I'll let Jonas answer this first, and I'll try to get it back. The logic of bipartisanship is deconstructed. The independence of senators is in reality limited. So the balances between the executive and the legislature don't work properly. And polarization undermines the logic of governance. How is this to be faced? I think what do we do in this situation is how I understand this question.
Yeah, that's a big question. I also believe that senators, to a large extent, behave more and more like party people. if you want. I mean, this doesn't imply that they are less integral or whatever, but they are senators of their party and they are less senators of the US. This has to do with the fact, I believe at least, that we have more and more solid red and blue states. I would feel, I mean, there is a whole discussion on whether Senate is a democratic institution. And I was reading somewhere that in 2050, half of the Senate will be representing about 25% of the country. I'm not sure about the figures, but in any case, this is a structural problem of the federalism, and I don't think we can escape that. There are ways to modify this, and to give you an example, Germany provides a system where the upper chamber has a sort of graduated representation. You don't have two senators, two members of the Bundesrat per state. You have between 3 and 7, I think, if I'm not wrong. So there are ways to make that, but that implies much more a change of the constitution. And the problem is that now that you mention it in your own speech, I can say that the US Constitution is a problem. I was teaching till last year that the US Constitution is an example in the sense of a very malleable text that allows for the representation. I start feeling that this is not the case anymore, or not the case as clearly as it would be. I would say that it is very difficult to reconstruct bipartisanship in the United States now. There will be bipartisanship on matters such as foreign affairs. China is a clear case of bipartisanship now. The Middle East may be, Russia, even the relationship with the Europeans, but the domestic items, I don't think that you can have bipartisanship. So I'm very much in favor of a majority. We have to allow the majority to govern. And at the same time, we must provide for balances for the minority. But these balances cannot be a hypothetical good Supreme Court for me. I did my studies in France, and the French constitutional law spoke about, disparagingly about a gouvernement des juges, a government of judges. In the United States, there is a government of judges, or there is not a government of judges, but there is the fear of a government of judges. And to a European audience, the fact that issues like abortion, the right to, no, not the right to bear arms, let's forget that, but campaign financing is not dealt by the law, but by the judges, is absurd. I don't know if I answered. It's a very big question, but I'm all for majority.
Yeah. I think so too. I think, in answering this question and also the question from Sean Atchison about demographics, I think these elements of the Constitution are rigid, are impossible to change. But what can change is the organization of parties. And so I would say the Republican Party, and this is a question that asks about demographics and the changing demography of the US. The constituency of the Republican Party is getting smaller. And so they are going to have to change. And, the median voter theorem, while it's maybe not accurate in lots of ways, that's going to drive, if they want to win elections, that's going to require them to change. And so I think, the one possible way out of this difficulty is through realignment, new issues coming to dominate elections. I don't have the faintest idea of what those might be, but that's at least one institution in American politics that can be flexible. We have, I think we have time for one more question if we go until 12:30. And so I'll read this next one, which is for Professor Papageorgiou and Professor Wagner. You mentioned the issues that the US system faces, but when did these issues start and what triggered them? It was the abilities that presidents have nowadays, which was it the abilities that presidents have nowadays that affiliate with the lack of leadership? The American system is known for its efficiency from the decade that it has been applied. What went wrong? Okay, so what has brought us to this point? Regina, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, honestly, I think a big part of it is the sort of the ideological polarization among elected officials, combined with the fact that you have more and more districts and states that are either red or blue, right? And so you're reinforcing that. And so you're basically, and in the Senate, a lot of senators want to not be senators forever. So a lot of them have recently been running for president. And the thing to run for president in the Senate is if you're sort of building up your profile as blocking the other side, right? That's sort of your, and one of the I think that was in another question too, was about Mitch McConnell, who openly said he's going to oppose 100% of the Democratic agenda. The fact that there is an incentive for Republicans to do that, I think that's sort of I would say that goes back again to what I said about primaries and who votes in those primaries, right? And what you're worried about. You're worried about being challenged from the left or from the right because you're not conservative or not liberal enough, or you're, compromising, you're giving the other side a victory, right? A win. And you're not supposed to be doing that. So I think those incentives are what are causing it, right? I mean, the US system, I think, is built way more on checks and balances than on efficiency, right? That's always a balancing act. But it could run more efficiently if you didn't give a lot of elected officials those incentives to just kind of, block things. So I think that I would say is what's causing it, that they think that the incentives are, you get more for blocking the other side than more awards for that than even for enacting some of your own programs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Jonas, would you like to have the last word on that?
I'm not sure. It's a poison chalice. I would say that this is perhaps linked to the emphasis on values. I think George Hawley spoke about the significance for the United in the UN, among the UN citizens, among the Americans, of identity politics. I think this is what makes, and this can be linked to various issues: race, crime, perceived race or perceived crime, migration to some extent. These are also issues that we see in Europe as well. I'm not sure. My opinion is that one reason, which I didn't have time to talk about, one reason why the system doesn't work a lot is the increased use of executive orders by the president. That is also, I mean, the Congress becomes important only in funding. Policy issues can be dealt by presidents alone. And that also, in a way, reinforces the president and delegitimizes the Congress, I'm afraid. To some extent, and then primaries are important, but I would go beyond primaries. Electoral participation in the United States is a problem. I mean, the abstention in the United States, with the exception of the last elections, the abstention is high. And if you take not only registered votes, but those entitled to vote who have not been registered for various reasons, it becomes even more a problem, a political problem, if you want. I'm sorry, I don't think I answered, but I don't know how to answer.
Okay, well, thank you. That really exhausts our time for this morning. Thank you to everyone who has attended, and especially thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to all of the students who were the technical support for this. That's very great. We had several students from Aristotle University and Matt Thomas from our university have worked together, and I hope it's been a positive experience for them too. We will be back tomorrow morning, our time, tomorrow late afternoon, your time, where we will shift to a discussion of foreign policy issues. So thank you. And yeah, thanks for all. This has been fun for me and interesting for me and given me things to think about. And I hope the same is true for you. So I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the students from all of us.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Yes. Yes, I think it went well.
Yeah, let's. Everyone was on time. I think everything was, and we have. I'll send you the link for the YouTube and